if you want to be a leader, you need to know how to serve. You need to know how to think far beyond outside of yourself, and think about your people and about your community. And that's what leadership is. Leadership can be really lonely too, right? It can be a lonely job standing on top of the hill. But if you're meant to stand on top of the hill, it's the only job you're meant to do. I'll be honest, I never, ever in my wildest dreams thought I'd be a leader back then. If you'd told me then in that moment with Rachel McDonald that, you're going to be a leader of people or of a company or anything like that, I would have thought you were completely nuts. I would have thought you were the drug addict. But what I saw in leadership, especially in particular, the leaders that I've been fortunate enough to work for and be inspired by, what I saw in the way they did that, I fell in love with.
Thanks for joining us once again on the Leadership and Performance Project podcast, where we get insights and learnings from the top performing leaders in all walks of life. If a better leadership story isn't around in Australia than that of today's guest, well, I haven't heard it yet. He's the CEO and founder of Cliqued Digital, a transformational leader, motivational keynote speaker around the world. He's the national brand ambassador for the Vinny's CEO Sleep Out, which is where I got the good pleasure of meeting him about 6 months ago, and he's sitting on the board of a number of Australia's leading companies. Matty Kratiuk, that's a pretty busy list of accomplishments right there, mate, but I don't reckon that even tells half the story. Welcome, and thanks for your time today on the podcast.
Thank you, Simon. You're far too kind, mate.
So, as I mentioned, I met you at the CEO Sleep Out in June. Yeah, pretty amazing story, mate. Like when I first met you, I didn't know you from a bar of soap, and just coming up and making us feel welcome, and then half an hour later, I hear this amazing story up on the stage. I'll get you to do a bit of a background on that. I don't want to focus too much on the story because it's amazing. I just couldn't do it justice here, I reckon, and I really want to unpack some of the leadership principles that you've picked up over your journey, the people, the circumstances that shaped what is Matty Kratiuk in 2021. But what I will do for all our listeners is I'll post a link to a brilliant podcast you did with James Deere on the Break the Chain podcast last year, which you tell your story so openly and honestly. It's I'd recommend it to all of our guys to listen to. But for the benefit of any of our listeners who haven't heard your story and what's behind where you've got to today, can you give us a bit of a background, sort of starting out as a kid, good middle class family in Sydney to where we're sitting here today, mate?
Yeah, sure, mate. There's a bit of a gap in the middle there, but mate, look, as you rightly said, life started off well. I came from a really good family, two very loving parents, little brother, just myself and my little brother Adam. And, when I was about 12, I was diagnosed with ADD and ADHD and hyperactive disorder. And my family at the time, even though we came from this amazing family, they were going through some turmoil of their own. My father's best friend died, his mother died, and, my mother and father, after 20 years of marriage, split. And we went from living in perfect surroundings but there being a lot of turmoil, a lot of trouble within the home. And then my father moved over to Cronulla and I followed him. I went over there with Dad because I was far too out of control to live with my mother. I started to rebel, started to get really angry as a kid. I'd run around, punch the walls in. I'd, assault my mother and I'd tell her to rack off and I'd run out the door and do whatever I wanted. And, I was just a little bit of a nightmare of a kid. I moved over with Dad to Cronulla. And you now had, I'm about the age of 15 now. I'd been expelled from two schools, Bankstown Grammar, then Cronulla High School. And, I was 15. My father had become an alcoholic, within a year. He went to, not being an alcoholic to drinking a bottle of scotch every night. And, you then had two guys, one was the frame of a child, sure, feel young man, 15-year-old. But essentially you had two men in one building, in a small apartment, both angry, both violent, both drinking all the time, and it was a recipe for disaster. I mean, I won't say much more than that, mate, but I ended up on the streets, and at the age of 15, and I remember they were hard years. It was, I was on the streets for a couple of years, and I mean, when I say street, I mean street. Sometimes, sure, it may have meant a mate's backyard or, a mate's garage, or, sometimes in a car or a spare room if there was one available, and my mate's parents would let me stay the night or whatever. But sometimes quite frequently it meant in a park. There'd be nights where I'd be sleeping in the rain, and I'd, leave the park, go over to the train station at Cronulla, sleep on the chair there because it had started raining, fall asleep, and then get kicked in the guts by the train guard, telling to get off the station at 4 a.m, and then back to the park where it's pissing down and I'm wet. They weren't easy times to go through as a kid. This is a really important time in a kid's life when your identity is being formed. And I remember watching kids from school that were in the same year as me walking up the alleyway on their way to Cronulla train station while I was there begging for change to buy hot chips because I hadn't had anything to eat. And I remember, some of these guys were my mates at school, and I remember being really ashamed and embarrassed. And even then, at 15, I remember having these thoughts that, while they're in their suit walking to the train station, I remember thinking, shit, that's never going to be my life now. Like, my life's done. I'm never going to be one of them, And I started to feed this lie right into my ears, and it started to form a wedge between me and society that would spiral out of control many moons later. Which was a me versus them complex. It's why I would become, it's part of why I would later become a drug addict and a drug dealer, and then a gang member, and then a criminal, and all these sorts of things. But to fast forward it, mate, I ended up on the Gold Coast at about the age of 18, and I went from being homeless to not being homeless, and I started dealing drugs, and I started making money, and I unintentionally found myself wrapped up in the world of criminality and drug abuse. I'd become a drug addict very quickly. And when you're in that world, mate, there's no planning, there's no forethought, there's no hindsight, there's no strategy. You're just caught in a cloud. You're living one day at a time, trying to get your next hit or your next fix or your next, earn or money or robbery or whatever it might be to get you by. And it's a vicious spiral. And then, of course, you're hanging out with some colourful characters. I myself became a very colourful character. Certainly wasn't because of who I was hanging around. I made all my choices my own, and I've always owned them. But I became a criminal, and that would sometimes look like extortion. It would look like home invasion. It would look like really horrible things, man. And these are things that were so far from what I was destined to be as a child. I had great dreams and aspirations to be a famous sports star, and I was a smart kid. I did really well at school when I focused, and suddenly I'm 19, 20, 21, and I'm wrapped up in a world of crime, and it's just nuts. That continued. I ended up in and out of prison. Ended up in Brisbane Correctional Centre at one point, and then I took off from Brisbane and I moved over to WA, and I ended up joining a bike gang. And I loved the club. I was in the club for some years, and to be honest with you, my criminality completely slowed down when I joined the club because, mate, I was a far bigger criminal before I joined the club because, when you're in a club, you're essentially immediately under investigation by the police. So, so I just stopped doing everything. But one thing I didn't stop doing, mate, was taking drugs, and I'd become a really, really bad drug addict. To tell this story a little bit faster than normal, what happened is my father died tragically. And, he was even though we'd had this fallout and we'd stopped talking, I loved him. I loved him to death. He was my dad. And I remember being a little kid and thinking he was my hero kind of thing, and suddenly he was killed real tragically, and it shocked me, mate. And at this stage, I was probably about 30 years old. I'd been a drug addict for 16, 17 odd years at that point. And I was so wrapped up in this world of criminality and ego, and just I was an absolute maniac. I was a borderline sociopath, and I just I didn't care about others. It was all about me and about what I could gain and take, and suddenly with the death of my father, it just rocked me. Like I started having these these deep seated remorse and guilt that I never got to tell how much, and that moment and opportunity had been stolen from me. And I said to someone the other day, one of my mates, they said, what's one of the key drivers to the transformation of your life? And I said, well, the lessons I've learned them all the hard way, but that's made me learn them exceptionally well. That message with my father is one of them. I've never, since that day, not told someone that I love them. Anyone in my life, friends, family, if I have those feelings towards them, I've always told them to their face. Because it was a lesson that hurt me a lot, and I just assumed there'd be more time for me to patch that up one day. When I get my shit together, I'll go back over there and, we'll sort it out, but it didn't work that way. Long story short, mate, I fell off the rails really, really bad. I mean, I was already a drug addict for 13 years, but when that happened, I got so much worse, and I ended up being kicked out of my own club. Rightly so. I was completely out of control on drugs. they had to do that. I don't blame them for doing it at all. And I'm now sitting in a hospital bed, and I was completely smashed physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and everything had been taken off me. I'd lost everything overnight. I'd gone from this guy with all this power and resource. I could do whatever I wanted, however I wanted, have whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. And I was just this shattered guy in a hospital bed, no idea what to do next. So I took off, and I went to Sydney, and mate, this is when I ended up back on the streets. And I was now 33, and I'd gone from living on the streets to being a criminal, essentially a career criminal, a drug dealer, and all this horrible stuff. I never did it. I'd never held down a job. I'd never paid tax. I just, all the normal things I just didn't do, right? Essentially, I'd been a stain on society's front door for 20 odd years, and this was the hardest moment of my life, and it was a moment I refer to as permanent torture because I was in so much pain, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. I even when I finally slept after being awake, I was an ice addict by this point for at least, I was a drug addict now. I'm 33. I was a drug addict for about 20 years. But, almost 15 of them, I was an ice addict. Like, I smoked ice every day, give or take, which is insane, right? And it's a miracle I'm still alive. But, and what that does to your brain is just chronic. It's life-changing, completely life-changing. I was spiraling out of control. I was in deep psychosis. I mean, I wouldn't sleep for 4 or 5 days at a time. And when I finally did sleep, even while I was sleeping, I had this chronic fear and anxiety in my stomach. It never went away. And I just got to the point where, I was like, what am I even bothering doing this for? Like, there's no plan. There's no way out of here. I'm a 33-year-old man on the streets. No one will even pick up the phone and answer a call to me anymore, not my family, not my friends. I've pushed everything and everyone that's ever been of value and love and purpose to me completely out of my life, And I just got to the point where, why am I even bothering? So on this particular day, I run out of my mate's house, and I took a gun off the table, and I ran down the park, and I'd made a commitment that I was going to end my own life. And I wrote a letter to my brother and my mother, and I hadn't spoken to them for years and years, and I apologised deeply. And I just said to them, I'm so sorry, this isn't your fault. Please don't hate yourself or blame yourself. This is my doing completely, all of it. It's my fault, not yours. And I own it, and I'm just so sorry. It's not what I ever intended this to look like. I'm so far from who I was meant to be, and I'm so sorry. It's not you. And I put the gun on my head, and I went to pull the trigger. And as I did, I had this vision of my little brother and I playing around the Christmas tree when we were children. And it was this beautiful scene, and it was lit up, and it was just, I remembered it so clearly, and I hadn't thought about it for years and years and years. And here's my dad sitting on his sofa, the one he always sits on, and there's my mum on the one she always sits on, and this scene was just lit up, and there's this beautiful Christmas tree with all the tinsel and the decorations, and here's my little brother Adam. He's 3 years old, and I'm 7 years old at the time, and there's all these presents under the tree because they used to spoil us silly, and here's Adam running around the Christmas tree chasing the golden retriever puppy that our parents had just bought us called Huggy. And this little baby golden retriever puppy wagging his tail and biting Adam. Adam's chasing him, and I'm chasing Adam as he's chasing Huggy. And then there was this moment where Adam just turned around and he looked up at my face, and I saw his face just look up at me like I was his big hero, And I just stopped, man, and I just put the gun down. And internet cafes were a thing back then, and I walked down the road to the internet cafe, and I punched rehab into the Google search engine, and a place came up. It was actually a Salvation Army rehab on the central coast of New South Wales. And, mate, I got in there 6 months later, and one of the greatest moments of my life certainly took place within about 6 weeks of getting into that program. And if you can imagine, I was a really violent, angry, confused guy, right? And I had no life skills, and I had only lived a gang and crime mentality. So I used to walk around with my arms out, like anyone that came in with tattoos all over them, I'd be on my toes and like, who's this? You want to have a crack? Like, I was just an idiot, absolute idiot, right? And I, running around like I'm the king of the rehab, like that's a claim to fame at 33. And anyway, so I'm 6 weeks into this program, and I'm in a verbal with my ex-partner, right? She was a drug addict as well. She was very broken, as was I. We were in a very toxic relationship at the time, and she was in another state, and I'm on the phone screaming abuse at her, yeah, F you and F you too, and she's like, yeah, F you and you fucking... And she'd just be screaming at me and calling me every name under the sun and blah, blah, blah. She wants to kill me and blah, blah. And I was saying the same thing, right? It wasn't pretty. Now, I'm completely oblivious to everyone's feelings on this program. There's 200 other clients there that have all probably been through horrific trauma. And the last thing they need to see is some crazy, bikey-looking guy like me screaming and carrying on and da-da-da. But I'm completely oblivious to it, and I'm screaming at the top of my lungs. While that happens, this little lady walks out of the chapel. I'd never seen her in my life. And cool as a cucumber, she walks up to me and she says, while I'm screaming, right, she goes, excuse me, mate, you need to come inside. Chapel's about to start.
Snap out of it.
Mate, I've just turned around and given her what for, and I have literally called her every colourful name under the sun that you can possibly think of at the moment. And she's just gone, righto, mate, and she's walked straight back into the chapel. She didn't give it another thought. Well, I didn't give it another thought. Anyway, to what happened next, and one of the boys on the program walks up to me real hesitantly after I'd finished the conversation with my ex, and very delicately walked over to me and he said, "Oi, Matty, bro, do you know who that was?" I said, "Who?" He goes, "Mate, that's the boss's wife." And I just went, "Oh, shit." And I just, oh no, you idiot. Right. So I've just told the boss's wife to F off and called her every name under the sun. And there's signs all around the rehab that said, first rule of the rehab, no threats of violence. If any of that, you're off. We'll escort you off the program. Thanks for coming. See you later. Pack your bags. And, I'm sitting there, and they didn't know the backstory. They had no idea of the trauma I'd been through. She certainly didn't. My caseworker knew bits and pieces, but I hadn't really shared much with him yet. So she had no idea that, just months earlier there was a gun pressed against my head. I was literally millimetres from taking my life, that there was no other option for me. There was no second chance. No one else would pick the phone up. I went through so much chronic fear and anxiety and trauma just to get in here. I was at the end of my tether. There was no other hope for me, right? And so I'm sitting there with my head in my lap going, she's about to come out, tell me to pack my bags, bugger off, and my life's over. There's nowhere for me to go. I can't wait another 6 months to get into a rehab. I'm going to jump straight in front of a train as soon as they drop me down at Wyong train station. I was 100% committed to it. Wasn't going to tell anyone, just going to, yep, no worries, thanks. I get it. I shouldn't have told you to F off, sorry. Get on the bus, and I was just going to do it, right? Save the world, the drama, right? And what she did next changed my life. She walked over to me and she said, "Mate, can you stand up, please?" And obviously I was really upset. I had my head down in my lap, and I was waiting for her. She came over with a security guard, and I was waiting for her to say, "Pack your bags, bugger off." She sort of crawled in underneath my chin because she's a bit shorter than me. Her name's Rachel McDonald. She's a good mate of mine today. And she got under me and she looked up at me and she said, "Mate, would you mind if I gave you a hug?" I said, "You what? What do you mean? What do you want to hug me for?" She goes, "Oh, because we love you, mate." Looked at me like I was stupid, like I didn't know. "Because we love you." I was like, "Oh." She goes, "It's all right, mate. Come here. I'm not going to hurt you. Let me put my arms around you. I'm just going to give you a hug." And I very awkwardly sort of leant down, didn't know how to do that, to be honest. And she just wrapped her arms around me, man. And, I couldn't cry at my dad's funeral, and some years earlier. And on this particular day, in front of 200 clients on this program in the middle of Duralong, I just exploded. I just exploded. There was tears coming out and snot falling out, and I just exploded. And she just wouldn't let me go. And she just said, "Listen, mate, you're okay. You're safe. We love you. You're safe. You're safe." And I guess that was the beginning of a theme that's really shaped my life over the last 7 to 8 years, and that is, for me to grow, and for anyone to grow, any of my staff or anyone that I lead today, or when I talk about leadership, that amazing growth, that profound transformation always, every single time, starts from a place of grace. It starts from a place of security. It starts from a place where my people know that they're safe. My people are encouraged to say shit that they may be wrong about. I'm not going to bark at them for it. It's the same. It's the same with me. I found for the first time in my life at that point that I was in a place where I was safe. These people loved me. And that then allowed me the ability to do all the really hard work, right? To start working on Matt Kratiuk, to start, working with caseworker and piece by piece peeling layer by layer back to figure out who is this guy, right? Under all this shit, all this addiction, all this trauma, at the heart of that, who is this guy really? And what we found, essentially, was a 14-year-old kid in a 33-year-old man's body.
Real journey of discovery, eh?
It was big stuff, man. Yeah. Big stuff.
That's an amazing story, mate. I've heard it and never fails to bring up those emotions.
I love it.
Just the things you've touched there. There's so many different sort of examples of leadership in there, and through the experiences and the people. Leaders need leaders, like yourself. I mean, where you are today, but where you were back then, and all the people that sort of helped you at that stage. And you talk about Rachel there.
Yep.
Like the majority of people that I suppose need to be led. Or want to be led. I think humans sort of crave to be led to a certain degree.
Absolutely.
Would come to the exact same conclusion you did. Like, she'd turn her back. Too hard, too intimidating, too scary, and put you back out down to Wyong. Like it was 100% where you were coming from. But she sort of really reached out and showed you that her understanding of what her purpose was, what the purpose of the program was taking people like you and getting that goodness shown in the heart. I think that's the fantastic example of leadership and
agree.
Caring for your people. The more that I learn on this leadership journey, the more I see that it's about that care, that compassion, the guidance, and everyone's got it in.
With the stuff that we do at Vinnie's, we always talk about servant leadership, right? And one of the sayings you'll hear me say all the time, it's one of my favourite ever, is that if serving is below you, leadership is beyond you. In other words, to lead is to serve, right? So, and if you don't have that in you, and mate, some leaders don't, but I don't call them leaders. I call them managers, right? Or bullfeds. But if you want to be a leader, you need to know how to serve. You need to know how to think far beyond outside of yourself, and think about your people and about your community. And that's what leadership is. Leadership can be really lonely too, right? It can be a lonely job standing on top of the hill. But if you're meant to stand on top of the hill, it's the only job you're meant to do. I'll be honest, I never, ever in my wildest dreams thought I'd be a leader back then. If you'd told me then in that moment with Rachel McDonald that, you're going to be a leader of people or of a company or anything like that, I would have thought you were completely nuts. I would have thought you were the drug addict. But what I saw in leadership, especially in particular, the leaders that I've been fortunate enough to work for and be inspired by, what I saw in the way they did that, I fell in love with. And that's what made me want to become a leader like them. I fell in love with the concept of giving value to people, right? Not because of what it gives me in return, but for a much more selfish reason that I just love the way it makes me feel.
And that's what drives all human behaviour, right? Like,
I just love the way it makes me feel, and I don't give a fuck what you say. I mean, I love the way it makes me feel when I do something good for someone. That's just genuine. The amazing outcome of that, as you would know, is that when we do that, quite often we get amazing things done for us as well, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's actually not why I do it. I do it because I really, really enjoy it. It makes me feel good. And, as someone that's had the life that I have, where I make no mistake, I've done a lot of bad shit. The more I feel good, the more healing takes place in my life as well.
Yeah, well, I've often said to people who don't understand what I'm talking about that, Mother Teresa, she's doing what she's doing for selfish reasons.
Yeah.
She's going through sacrifice and people look at me like I'm crazy, but she's doing it because that's what makes her feel good and she understands it, yeah.
Rachel McDonald did it to me because that's the human that she is, man, and that's, it was her faith that she holds in the highest regard, and it's who she is as a human being. And so I just thank God that she did, mate, because I wouldn't be here if she hadn't.
Absolutely. And going on from your time with Vinnie's, getting back out into the world,
so it's confusing. So a little bit confusing. So the program I did was not Vinnie's; it was the Salvation Army.
Sorry, yeah.
but the work I do today is with Vinnie's. And someone asked me the other day, why do you want, like, because I do help both organisations. I thoroughly love both organisations, and both of them have had a huge impact on my life. And someone said, almost like, is it competition? Like, can you? And I said, listen, mate, I'm not prepared to miss out on the divine for a technicality, but yeah, I adore both those organisations and many, many, many more like them, right? And I think the more of them, the better, especially at the moment. But yeah, I did that program with the Salvos down there, and then yeah, I met Vinnie's when I in the corporate world some years later, which we'll talk about in a sec.
Absolutely. So back on your feet after leaving the program and getting back out into the wide world, like I said, sort of building on that 14-year-old and the 33-year-old's body.
Yeah.
Got to be pretty tough, yeah, coming out. You're fairly well publicised what you'd been through. You'd come back from the brink.
Well, that's a funny story. So, look, mate, it was really tough. I'll be honest with you. I'd done 13 months in that program. While I was in the program, I went back to school and I did a diploma in business. And, there was my caseworker was really supportive, and I was like, listen. His name was James Fitzsimmons. I said, James, I really want to study business, right? And there were other people that were like, listen, mate, you probably should be a drug and alcohol counsellor. You're covered in tattoos. You're an ex-gang member. You're an ex-drug addict. You've got a massive criminal history. You've got no work history. Why don't you just become a drug and alcohol counsellor?
The well-worn formula here that this is where you
go. Like, you should work with drugs and alcohol. And I'm like, well, no, I don't want it. I want to work in business. I want to actually, in particular, I want to be an executive salesperson, right? And
so could you come out of the program sort of thinking at that stage that you could be one of those guys that you saw at the train station walking to work in the suits?
That was the dream. It was absolutely the dream. As I pictured myself in a suit with on the way to on the train on the way to the city to work. That was my dream. Right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's what you bang on. I've never even thought of that before. Maybe that was part of it. It was that was that thing that got away from me when I was a kid, and maybe that's what it was. But look, the point of the story was, there were lies in my head that would say, no, listen, mate, no one's going to take you seriously. You can't. And back then, it was, tattoos. These days, much better. But back then, mate, in my career, I've only ever been the only executive I've ever sat at an ELT or an SLT on our SLT or ELT. I'm the only one that I've ever known to have tattoos on their hands and necks, right? So I just got in at the right time, kind of thing. But there was there was a lot of doubts, and there was a lot of lies, but I just kept pushing and said, no, this is what I want to do. And thankfully, James was a great caseworker, and he said, you can do anything you want, mate. You can put your mind to it. The world's yours. So I did, and I went to Hunter TAFE up there, did a diploma in business, got it, graduated, won the Industry Excellence Award and all this sort of stuff, and I got thoroughly excited by that world, right? Here's the catch. I came out of the rehab after 13 months, and I didn't have I had no resume. I had no work history. I had nothing. But I had the right attitude, and I started going for all these jobs, right? And I had, entry-level sales roles or BDM roles or something like that, but, I didn't have the experience and whatever. But I knew if I could get in the interview and look these guys dead in the eye, I could sell them, And I did, and I went for, I reckon 40, 50 interviews, mate. There were stacks, and I'm living with my parents at this point, my mother, rather, and I'd that was pretty embarrassing. I was 33, living with my mum, or 34 or something, and
pretty common now.
Yeah, right.
Those house prices.
Yeah, but the good thing, of course, is we'd rekindled that relationship because we hadn't spoken for a very long time, and she was welcoming back to the home, and anyway, so going for all these job interviews, and I felt like I was nailing these interviews, right? And they'd be like, oh, mate, look, we love your attitude, your passion. We think you'd be great at the job, da-da-da-da. We'll talk about a package. We'll come back to you and we'll speak to you in the next couple of days. And then, beep, crickets. I wouldn't hear a thing, right? And I'd be like, what's going on? And, mate, I started to get really deflated. It was really, really hard, right? Because I'd done all this work and I felt like, shit, the world's just not going to give me a go. How do I make this work, right? And I was starting to get really depressed, and I was, sleeping in too much, and, I'd do sleep 12 hours a day. It was what we call the danger zone, mate. As an ex-addict, this is the danger zones. You got to be on real high alert. And, I was really close to falling off the wagon. And I I ended up ringing the last guy and I said, listen, mate, what's going on? Like, it was actually, I think it was like a Kennard's Hire or something like that. And I rang him up. Well, the company looked great and the job looked great. And the guy rang me up and said, listen, mate, I really like you, Matt, but have you ever punched your name into Google? And I said, no. And he said, well, mate, you should give it a crack. And so I've punched my name into Google. Now, at the time, the Salvation Army did this great story on me, right? And they'd published it online. And although it was a really good story, about transformation and about all the great stuff that happened, there was a photo of me with my arms crossed on the front, kind of like looking the business. And the top line said, the first line that came up when you, and I'm the only one spelt my way, the only name that's spelled like mine in Australia that I know of, right? So when you punch my name in, the first thing that came up was a photo of me, and the top line said, Matt Kratiuk has lived a life of violence, drugs and extreme crime, right? And so every HR department at any company is doing research and going, no.
Clicking on that headline.
Too much risk, not happening, blah, blah, blah. And then, just as I was about to give up, I went for a job at a place called Home Improvement Pages, which is Australia's #1 site to hire tradespeople from. And if you've ever watched The Block, you'll see them as the major sponsor. They are, the second greatest place in Australia to work, voted in my, and even including Click Digital, mate, which we'll talk about later. I still think they're my first place. They are remarkable, and the culture is unbelievable. And so I go for this job interview in this company called High Pages, right? This sexy tech startup company, and there's like 300 people there, and I was like, whoa, and I walked in, and it was just like something out of the movies. It was just firing, and I remember thinking to myself, man, this is the dream, right? And I got the train in there from, Cronulla at the time to the city, right in the middle of the city, and I was just like, wow, this place is amazing. And I was really worried that I was just going to get shut down like the other 30, 40, right? Anyway, first interview passed. Second interview passed. Next minute they send me an email to say, congratulations, you got the role. When can you start? And I was like, you little ripper. I couldn't believe it. And, mate, I was so excited, but I was so nervous, right? I was really afraid. What I had assumed is that these guys had somehow misspelt my name, or they didn't do the research properly, or, Sally from the HR team made a boo-boo. I don't know what it was, right? But somehow they missed it, right? So I felt like I fluked my way in there, right? And I felt like a fraud, to be honest. And I got into the business, and within the first sort of 3, 4, 5 months, I just smashed all the sales records to pieces. And I was just having a ball. I was loving it, absolutely loving it. I loved my job. I loved what we did. I loved helping the tradies. I thought it was fantastic. And and it showed. I just went, I was really loud, and it affected the team in a positive way. I just went bananas. And so I get an email from the executive assistant of David Vitek, who's one of the CEOs at the time and co-founder. And I hadn't met David properly yet, but I'd seen him walking around. He's the boss. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, that's the big boss, And, he didn't say much, but he was a smooth criminal, right? He's a smooth cat. He's not a criminal. By the way, definitely not a criminal. He's a good mate of mine, legend. But he was a smooth cat, right? And anyway, so I get this email saying Dave wants to take you to lunch. And I'm like, oh, shit, what's going on here?
It's going to go one way or the other.
Well, I'm thinking maybe he's found out. Like maybe the jig's up, and I'm, on my way out or something. The dream's over, right? I'm going back to mum's to look for more jobs, right? And so we go to this little Vietnamese place, and we're eating Vietnamese rolls. And I'm petrified. I'm absolutely got the worst anxiety because I've kept my story so under wraps. Bar 1 or 2 guys that I felt I could trust, I kept it really under wraps. I didn't feel could let anyone know about it yet, right? And we're eating this Vietnamese roll, right? And he goes, Matt, I just want to tell you how proud I am of your story. And I just shit myself. I just froze. I was like, fuck. And he goes, I'm so proud. And I just went, what do you What do you mean, mate? What are you talking about? You mean the sales or what? He said, no, your story. I was like, what? And then he quoted the article, the name of the article, and I just almost fell off my chair. I was like, what? Here I am, like, hiding it from everyone. And I said, mate, do you know? And he goes, of course I know, you buffhead. Have you seen how big our HR team is?
Run a tech company.
Right, exactly right. And he's like, mate, they brought every article to me, that one plus others, plus everything else that's online about you. And as I said to them, you had done enough work at that point in your life, and work that you should be commended for, that I felt that someone needed to give you a go. And that was in my career, in the corporate world, that was the moment my life changed. Because, once again, same principle as before with Grace, right? Here's this guy who is literally, one of the most successful, famous CEOs in Australia, right? One of the greatest tech stories in Australia, and a really smart entrepreneurial guy. He saw something in me that, and this is what leadership is, right? He saw something in me that I didn't particularly know was even there yet, right? I felt something, but he saw something, right? And he was in a position where he could validate that and say, you belong here. And the moment he did, I just took off, absolutely took off.
And for 6 months prior to that, he knew anyway. And he
well, he took a punt.
leading quietly from the back, Didn't have to be out there waving the hands.
He really did, man. And then, I had this lunch that we did with the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, the Honourable John Howard. He was one of the speakers at this lunch, and I was the other speaker. And High Pages actually went behind my back, because this is what I was trying to keep it all sort of under wraps, and had contacted where I was speaking and said, listen, we want 2 secret seats on one of the tables there, and we want to come there and support Matt Kratiuk. He's one of our employees, and that was the CFO, Kyle Cope, and David Vitek, the CEO. And so, to once again have these guys that were, amazing business leaders, certainly some of the most respected business leaders in our business community, and to have them behind me and backing me, I felt that was the moment where I had this revelation: I belong here, and I'm allowed to be here, and that was really, really important for me and for my growth and my career.
Yeah, I spoke to Owen Eastwood a little while ago. I was mentioning him before in his book, and it's called Belonging. And he views that leadership role as making people feel safe, making people feel that they belong, and providing them the best environment to do what they do.
Couldn't agree more.
And you hear that time and time again.
Yep, absolutely.
I want to digress onto another, this saying, leaders breed leaders, and we've already talked about Rachel, David. Leaders need leaders, and then leaders breed leaders. And we've talked about 2 of the leaders over the years that have impacted you.
Yeah.
While I was researching your story, I was really interested to hear your involvement and friendship with Andrew Chan, one of the members of the infamous so-called Barley Nine.
Yep.
Very similar story to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, with a much more tragic end, but you guys struck up a bit of a friendship. But in listening to one of your or reading one of your stories there, the thought that when you're in some of your dark times, and people always say there's always someone worse off than you.
Absolutely.
I think I wondered if exploring sort of how Andrew Chan and that relationship you had with him, in a way, was the type of leader he was, because I've read a bit about him since, and he was he'd done that transformation that you'd done. But had to spend his time in prison.
Yeah.
He didn't have the opportunities to get out, and he sort of took those opportunities to lead people there right up until the very end.
He did,
from what I hear, and
literally to the very end. Yes, that
leadership that he has for you, and I'm sure for other people that he is involved with, there's a legacy in leadership. It's not necessarily just this leaders breed leaders, sort of passing the baton on and passing things forward. Andrew provided that leadership for you, and
he did. He was a beautiful human being. I mean, I didn't know Andrew prior to him going to prison, and I met Andrew through a really good friend of mine, Owen Pomana, who's funnily enough, Owen and I used to live together back in the crazy days, and he was certainly a completely out of control gangster. He was off his head. He was nuts. And he would become this amazing Christian minister. He would have this amazing transformation story of his own, and go on to live an amazing life. He's doing amazing things in New Zealand at the moment. And I love Owen. He's a good mate of mine. And Owen, when all this transformation stuff happened in my life, he sort of rang me up and said, "Listen, man, have you thought of, because I am a man of faith, and it's been a huge part of my transformation. I certainly wasn't before." And, you know, that's certainly guided and molded a lot of the values, the core values and beliefs that I have today. And so I went and did some ministry stuff with him overseas, and one of the opportunities that presented itself was to minister to Andrew, right? And as you know, they were on death row, right? And they'd been there for 10 years. And, mate, to put it simply, Andrew was just who I was. I mean, he was caught up in the wrong shit, he was impressed by the wrong things, ego got in the way, money, girls, this, that, and the rest. Like, he made a few dumb decisions. I made so many more than Andrew has, so many. But I'm sitting here to tell the tale. I'm really proud to say that I don't make any of those decisions today, any of them. But I made so many more than him, you know. And so for me, Andrew was, you know, I didn't know Andrew well at all until I started to get to know him, and we had a lot of intimate conversations. And you know, I just could not fault him at any point. He was just remarkable. I would have conversations with him about how angry I was with the president, right? And how at the time I was a man of faith, and I'm not meant to have these feelings and hate people and and I should be praying for my enemies and all this sort of stuff. And I'd have these open and honest conversations with him. And here is a guy who is about to be executed by this man. And his response to me was, Matt, listen, I love him. And I'm praying for him. Right? And I'm just like, how do you say about the guy that's about to execute you that you love him and that you're praying for him? And that's what he said. He said, man, listen, man, I'm okay. He's like, I'm totally at peace. I love him. I love the president. I love his family. And I believe God chose him for a reason, and whatever will happen is God's will, and I'm okay. And I just, here I am on the other side, bawling my eyes out, right? Like, and here's this dude that was just completely at peace, and he was the real deal. Like, he really was. He probably wasn't before. Yeah. In fact, he definitely wasn't before. I definitely wasn't before. But, you know, I think he taught me so much about transformation and about how real that can be, and about how it has to start from the inside, right? Because to be a leader, right, is a direct result of your character, right? And character, in my view, is character comes from contrast, right? It comes from experiencing things from one level to the other. Guys like Andrew and myself, we've experienced things from one level to the other like most people couldn't possibly fathom, right? I've experienced, you know, and just an example that comes to mind, I've experienced the craziest of violence to the most remarkable amount of love, right? Like, I've seen the world at its most beautiful, and I've seen it completely evil. And believe it or not, these experiences are a big part of what create character in a human being. If I didn't have all these experiences, I wouldn't be the leader that I am today, and I wouldn't be someone that reflects as much as I do. And that's really important as a leader too, right? That's how you create emotional intelligence. Is I spend, things weigh on me more than they do other people. If I got something wrong, it actually eats me up, and I've got to fix it. Like, no matter what that is. If I told Jenny to bugger off, or not that. By the way, we don't have a Jenny here, and if we did, I would never tell her to bugger off, right? But you know, whatever that might be, it weighs on me, and it hurts me because of my character, and that's so important. That's a good thing, right? Andrew taught me so much about character, and he taught me, he taught me a lot, man, and it brings up emotions sitting here talking about him, because I know I was one of the last people that got to communicate with him before he was executed. And, you know, I know there's people out there that probably go, oh, yeah, you only changed his life because he had to, and he was just trying to get out of jail, and right? And I've heard all that shit on social media, and I just think you imbecile twats that have no idea what you're talking about. You're just agreeing with the buffhead next to you. Like, smarten up and think for yourself, you know? And the fact is, mate, he was the real deal. This was a genuinely transformed man. He was transformed from above, inside out. And I love him dearly, you know. And he taught many of us. Yeah, he was a great man.
That's the end of part 1 of Matt's amazing story. Make sure you tune in for part 2, where Matt outlines his leadership philosophy and the people and the experience that have shaped who he is today, and how he applies those philosophies to everything he does, from his business to his own life to the work that he does in the community. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again on the Leadership and Performance Project podcast.